Hi, welcome back to Module 2. This is where we're going to be talking about creating our problem statement, or you can think about narrowing down your topic. I really like how this slide helps us see a big picture of where we're going. So if we start and think about the research process, there really are four components of that. We have to have a research question, we have to determine our research design, we'll collect and analyze data, and then we'll publish that data or we'll talk about that data. So for the sake of this lecture or this module, we're going to be thinking about how we create that research question. And that can be broken down further. First, we have to think about selecting a problem or a topic. We'll talk a little more about that in just a second. Also, we have to review the literature. This is going to lead us to our third module eventually, but it is a huge component. Next, we have to develop our conceptual framework. We have to think about how we're going to frame or consider our topic. Next, we have to create some research questions, or those things that we hope to address and answer in the research process. We have to identify our variables and then ultimately clarify our hypotheses. So, for the sake of this section, or this purpose of our writing, we will be addressing all of these areas. What's the problem? That is what we want to try to address. That is, we want to pick a research problem. This slide gives us some ways that we can think about how we might want to address or what problem we might want to address. First of all, popular issues. There are a number of key things going on in our sports world today. For example, the use of analytics to consider team rosters, especially in the NBA and Major League Baseball. Maybe that's an issue you want to consider further. Are there some personal characteristics? That is, are there things that you like or that are personal to you? Have you had any brainstorming sessions? Have you talked with faculty? Or maybe you're a practitioner in the industry and there are some things that you want to consider to understand more or to help make some leeway. Maybe you want to consider some reform. There's also social concern, particularly we've seen this in the last year in the NFL, social concern regarding athletes using their platform for political protest. There are a number of ways that we could look at that issue. And then finally, we have to consider the existing literature. That will help us to understand a question or a problem that we can address. So let's talk first about reviewing the literature. This has a major purpose throughout our entire process. First, we have to think about evaluating, reading, and organizing the current literature on the topic. I'm going to ask you to think back of the classes that you have taken throughout your master's degree. And some of those classes have taught you particularly how to use our HBU Moody library system and how to search for scholarly literature. Also, the purpose of the literature review is to demonstrate that you, the researcher, know this topic. You know the ins and outs of it. Next, it will help you narrow your question. If you have these broader questions, it will help you to narrow it down and get at a specific area. It will also give you theories and concepts. It'll help you develop your hypotheses. You'll consider past methods that have been used to address or research the topic. And then ultimately, it'll provide comparisons of your topic to past research. This is really important. So what are our sources for literature? First of all, primary sources. Peer-reviewed scholarly journals are what we will consider primary sources. This is where you will find most of your key information in order that you can situate your project in the literature. Next, you'll also though want to consider textbooks and books, websites, past theses and dissertations, and or newspapers and magazines. That will help you give some information about the current topics on the current climate of those topics. Next, we need to consider our conceptual and or theoretical framework. The conceptual framework is a novel framework, a new one that's developed by the researcher. For the most part, I'm going to just speculate that we will be considering theoretical frameworks, or frameworks that have previously been established in the literature. A theoretical framework is the lens at which you want to look through when examining your topic. It helps you then explain or understand the phenomenon by addressing questions of particular relationships, circumstances, or events. Ultimately, these theories become the framework for your project. Let me give you one thought on this. You may want to think about it this way. Let's just say that it is the lens at which we are going to examine something. And an easy way to think about this is oftentimes we examine topics across different lenses. We may look at a track meet based upon, we would say, an economic lens, how much money that track meet could make. We could look at that from a biomechanical lens to understand how the athletes work or run biomechanically. Maybe we want to look at it from a sociological lens to understand the relationships. That just gives us an easy example to consider then when we look at things through different lenses, we'll examine them in different ways. Our theoretical framework will help us do this. We'll connect it to theory, and those theories will be our guiding lens for our research. Once we have an idea of a general topic in mind, how do we narrow that topic and create a research question? First, we need to consider the gaps or weaknesses in the existing literature. We'll also need to think about our questions or our topics. Are they broad, narrow? Is it clear and concise? Also, is it possible to answer our question in a logical and reasonable manner? Do you have the skills? Is the topic feasible? Do you have access? That's our next concept. Last, do you think it will ultimately yield interesting and useful results? When you're examining your problem or research question, you'll also need to identify any variables. Independent variables are those that are controlled or manipulated, and our dependent variables are those that are outcomes, and they are dependent upon. They're the variable of the interest in the study. The next area to consider when we're talking about our research problem or question is our hypotheses. It's the suggested or expected relationship based on prior research. It helps us answer the question, what do we expect to find, or what do we expect to be our outcomes? First, it has to be adequate to explain our findings or relationships. It also must admit some empirical testing by means of data or analysis. It has to require relatively few assumptions, and it needs to possess better explanatory power than other alternatives. To sum up the things that we have done thus far, I want to point out that when we're looking at the big picture, or our 5 chapters we'll be completing for our thesis project, all of the items we've discussed in this section will become components of Chapter 1. This is where you will introduce your research project and determine your problem statement. Also, I want to talk briefly about your annotated bibliography. That's actually going to be addressed in the next section. Doing our annotated bibliography will help us address a number of these things that we've mentioned in the above slides. For the sake of our project, students will be completing an annotated bibliography. The goal of it is to be critical or analytical in nature. It will require that you examine the current literature on your topic and briefly provide a critical or an analytical discussion about the article. You'll need to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the articles, and also it will allow you as the researcher to consider how those articles could then apply to your own research. This will be a very, very helpful process as we help think about narrowing that question, getting at some of our other pieces in terms of variables and hypotheses, as well as understanding our conceptual and our theoretical framework.